I would like to introduce Jill Bender, who will be presenting Inclusive Interviewing in Tech, How to Create an Inclusive Hiring Process. Jill is a software engineer at Terawatt Infrastructure and is coming to us today from Seattle, Washington. This is Jill's second time presenting at NANOG. Jill's first talk at NANOG was called Inclusive Hiring in Tech, How to Write More Inclusive Job Descriptions at NANOG 84 in Austin in the year 2022. Welcome back to NANOG, Jill. It's a pleasure to have you back with us today.
Hello, my name is Jill Bender. I'm a software engineer, and I'm passionate about making tech a place where anyone who wants to build the future can thrive. I'm so glad to be here to share some practical and memorable tips for you to make your hiring process more inclusive. I'm here because I am passionate about building a future in technology that is diverse. Because I'm a woman, I'm often asked by hiring managers, how do I hire more women? Curiosity is a great place to start, and I invite you to think bigger about diversity within your team. With more perspectives, we can solve challenging problems in new ways. So ask yourself, how do I hire a more diverse team? How can I include people from different races, genders, and backgrounds? I'm here to help you answer this question for your own team, whether you are interviewing candidates, or if you're a hiring manager, or you're a job candidate yourself, just wanting to understand more about the process. So the problem with our hiring pipelines is that they are leaky. This diagram shows all the different stages of the hiring process, and at every point in this process, we can lose people from underrepresented groups that doesn't necessarily meet the statistical representation of your hiring pipeline as a whole. In my previous talk at NANOG, we talked about improving diversity of your candidate pool by writing a more inclusive job description. Today, we're going to talk about the next stage where diverse candidates tend to meet a barrier. That is the hiring process. There are talented, qualified candidates that are out there, and we're here to learn why they might not be getting through your interview process. So today, we'll go through a brief history of bias in hiring to learn how we got to where we are today. Then we'll understand what bias is and where it might show up. And then we'll come up with some best practices and some tips that you can build into your hiring process. And lastly, building a culture to make sure that those practices stick. So let's start with a history of bias in hiring. Let's go back to a time when we didn't have laptops or desktop computers or processors in our phones. In order to do complex mathematical computations, you had to do it by hand with pen and paper and maybe a slide rule. The people who did these calculations were called human computers. Men were hired to do these calculations, but as the need for more and more complex calculations rose, so did the cost. Because of societal opinions at the time, in order to reduce costs for computation, organizations realized that they could hire women and people of color to do it for less. They realized anyone who had the skills could do this work. It's a very important and technical job, and they actually proved that there's no innate ability to do math based on your gender or the color of your skin. And so starts the story of these hidden figures, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and Katherine Johnson. Their contributions were often overlooked or downplayed due to racial and gender discrimination. They made significant contributions to the space program and helped lay the foundation for advancements in computing that would shape the future of technology. So this brings us to ENIAC, the world's first general-purpose electric digital computer. Its development played a significant role in getting computing technology to where it is today. The idea was to take an electronic machine that could perform all of the complex calculations in a fraction of the time that it would take human computers to solve. There were over 100 women hired to do calculations for ballistic trajectories in World War II. In 1945, 6 women were selected to figure out how to program the ENIAC machine. Men with elite degrees saw this work as very dull, and they wanted to focus more on the hardware. So this was really seen as women's work. Software was considered women's work like typing or filing. So it was left to these women to figure out how to make it all work. There were no programming languages, and there were no manuals for the operation. They had to leverage their deep understanding of math and problem solving in order to program ENIAC. They even told their male colleagues how to make the hardware better. So it turns out, as we know today, programming is hard, and women are just as good at it as men. And something happened that made the stereotype shift. So what changed? Computers were large, expensive, and they had limited access. The only time programmers really had free access to tinker and learn was at night. In many cases, this actually physically prevented women from accessing the computers because of gender norms at the time. They were prohibited from staying at the office after business hours. Without women getting the same access to resources, men started to gain a certain reputation. They would emerge from these nighttime coding sessions disheveled, and they started to gain a reputation as this eccentric antisocial geek. Male programmers wanted to be taken seriously for their jobs, and they wanted their jobs to be seen more elite than women's work. So there was a push to make programming more professional, which disproportionately benefited men. Ads began to connect women staffers with error and inefficiency. Tests with logic and math puzzles gave men who had taken math classes an advantage. Personality tests claimed to find the ideal programming type. The men who developed this test selected for a disinterest in people, and so reinforced this antisocial computer geek that we know today. We now live in a world where computer programs are expected to be male, nerdy, and antisocial. And we forget the women and people of color that the entire field was built upon. Tech companies big and small are notorious for still using these math and logic puzzles in hiring to this day. So when we stop and take a look at the effectiveness of our current hiring methods, we actually find that they are not producing the results that we want. And looking at the history, we can see how we got to where we are. This research by NC State and Microsoft reveals that these whiteboard coding tests we do today are actually better at predicting if somebody has performance anxiety than the actual job skills. So now that we have all this evidence that our hiring techniques are severely gender biased and biased in other ways, we're still using them. So in part 2, let's learn a little bit about bias and the problems that we have in our existing hiring process. Bias in hiring can lead to discrimination, lack of diversity, and a missed opportunity for your organization to benefit from a wide range of talent. To improve the diversity in your hiring process, let's think about why we interview in the first place. The main goal is for the company and the candidate to decide if the candidate will be successful and happy in the role. The company has an idea of what they need for this role and uses the interview process, ideally, to collect evidence and data on a candidate to then make a decision on whether or not they want to hire the person for the role. Cognitive bias can get in the way of a good decision-making process. Our brains help us make sense of this very complicated world around us. Our biases can help us make use of stats that we've gathered over time to make quick decisions, to quickly decide, should I get out of the way of this speeding car? Biases can also hurt us because our subconscious is often inaccurate and misleading. We develop these mental shortcuts based on stereotypes. When we're in the hiring process and a person's credentials are ambiguous, our brains use these stereotypes in order to fill in the blanks. And this is a problem when we're trying to get an accurate perception of somebody's abilities. You might be thinking, I've had a lot of training, I know about this stuff, I would never be biased. Perceiving yourself as objective can actually correlate with having more bias. So I'm here to tell you that we all have biases. And the more that we acknowledge they exist, the more we can learn to block our common biases to make better decisions. So let's go through what a few of these common biases are. Conformity bias. We love to see what other people are thinking, so we change our opinion based on what the rest of the group might think. Affinity bias. This is also called like me bias, where we favor people who are like us. The first impression bias. We make a decision often about somebody within the first 10 seconds of meeting them. If they give us a bad handshake, it can really impact the way that we feel about that person. Next is contrast error. This is where you're comparing candidates against one another instead of evaluating each individual based on their skills. And lastly, comes up a lot, education and credential bias. Somebody might have a fancy Ivy League degree, and you might overlook their actual abilities based on that degree. Now, there are hundreds of biases out there. You can continue to learn about them probably for the rest of your life, but these are a lot of common ones that show up in the interview process. So let's do an exercise together. Let's see what you picked up. Here are some statements that often show up, and here are the different types of bias. So what kind of biases show up here? I would have a beer with them. Affinity, good. Kim told me the candidate wasn't a good fit from the last interview, and I trust Kim. Conformity, nice. And this person doesn't have the same command line skills as the last person in this role. Contrast error, good. You guys are experts already. So let's move on to some best practices for inclusive interviews. We all have biases. We can't not be biased, but there are some best practices to help us in our decision-making practices to block this bias. So what we're going to talk about is building a welcoming culture with fair hiring criteria done in a repeatable way with consistent evaluation standards. So getting to that welcoming environment, something that you should learn about is stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is something that happens when you are worried that you're going to confirm a negative stereotype. For me, I might walk into a room full of men and think, I need to do well to show women can code. That's a lot of pressure, and it does impact performance. To reduce stereotype threat for candidates going through your hiring process, there are some things you can do. You can remove, in the area where the person is doing interviews, geeky posters and decorations, have a diverse interview panel, and definitely avoid calling out anything that might make a candidate feel isolated in the process. And just be welcoming. All candidates interviewing are a little nervous. Instead of intimidating every candidate, try and show them what it's really like to work with you every day. Next is moving on to the fairness component. An argument that I hear all the time for not wanting to focus on diversity in hiring is that it will lower the bar. What is this bar that you have anyways? It turns out that bar is a moving target depending on who you are. If you went to the same college as me, I might give you some hints on a question subconsciously that help you do better. So is that the same bar for everybody? Interviewers tend to hold underrepresented groups to a different standard than the in-group. One way to combat this is to clearly define what the bar is so that it doesn't change in every hiring loop. By strengthening that bar, you can actually have a real standard that you can hold to for technical competency. So let's go through some tips for strengthening that hiring bar. Pick criteria that you can measure. Generic phrasing like strong technical skills isn't specific enough and can be open to interpretation. Use the same criteria Even if it's the president's nephew or a Harvard grad, doesn't matter, everybody gets the same criteria. Also, remember from the history lesson, pick the right questions that are fair in your process. And it's important to check those assessment criteria to make sure that those criteria themselves remove bias and reduce bias. So I'm a software engineer, so this is a scorecard that you can use to clearly define those criteria that every interviewer will use. You can coordinate between your hiring panel to make sure maybe one person focuses a little more on communication, another person focuses a little bit more on code quality. You can really make this whatever you need for your organization, but the important part is that you have an explanation. For whatever rating that is collected during the interview, make sure there is a detailed and specific explanation showing evidence about why they believe that rating should be chosen. This can really help put in a pause in the process for the interviewer to make sure they are reducing bias as much as possible. And once you've set your criteria, it's time to develop a way to actually gather evidence that the candidate can do the job. So when you're conducting your assessments, I recommend getting rid of the whiteboard interview. Whiteboard interviews are prone to bias, and it doesn't actually assess a candidate's skills. So if somebody's going to be writing code every day, I personally don't write code on a whiteboard every day. I do it on a computer. And these whiteboard tests are better at testing anxiety, and they have a heavy focus on really one limited set of skills around algorithmic thinking and problem solving, and really not much to do with working on larger projects or demonstrating actual coding. So when you're developing these assessments, I recommend coming up with questions and tests that test the real skills of the day-to-day job. For a software engineer, that's writing code. For example, in an interview, you could have a pair programming, fix the bug exercise in your code base. For other roles, it might be a collaborative technical design exercise. If you do choose to do a take-home assignment, I recommend keeping it short. If somebody is the primary caregiver for their family, they might not have time to do a 4-hour assessment. So with these assessments, you can additionally give high marks to candidates that come up with a novel solution, something that's different than what you would usually see to promote a diversity of perspectives. And to keep things fair, make sure it's a standard interview format. Use the same format for every candidate. Remember, sometimes we want to give extra hints or tips or make things easier for people who are like us. And it's your job to keep track of time and make sure you're hitting the questions for everybody fairly. This is an example interview format that I use in my interviews. And at the start of every interview, I humanize it. I make it welcoming, make sure everybody feels welcome and calm, and I tell them what we're going to do that can reduce nerves and make sure that the process goes smoothly. And most importantly, interviewing is a two-way street, so make sure you give them time to ask questions at the end. And another key thing to reduce bias is that your interviewers independently submit their feedback. Do this as soon as you can after the interview process. The longer you wait, the more those stereotypes tend to play in and can impact the way that you felt about a candidate. You can write down all of your information as soon as you can, and you don't have to make a decision yet. The important thing is that you get the evidence written down from your interview, and then you can decide what you want to make. Before you make your decision, do not look at your other interviewers' feedback. This will bias your opinion. So try to make an independent decision before you start to look at other people's feedback. You can still talk about it together later, but it's just important to get a pure and raw set of data about your interview. And this brings us to the consistent evaluation. When you get together to discuss a candidate's performance, hold each other accountable to the previously agreed upon criteria. Underrepresented candidates are often held to a higher standard because they don't fit the stereotype. We can prevent some of that bias by making sure that we ask the same questions of every candidate. I think many of the technical women in this room could identify with hearing the phrase, well, is she technical enough? And if you're asking this of all the women in an interview process, make sure you're asking that same question of all the men. And it's a good gut check to say, oh, I might be introducing bias in the process here because I'm not asking this question for every candidate. This also comes up for people who might have an accent. If people are asking, oh, is their English good enough? If you're not asking that same question of every candidate, you're probably introducing bias. So this brings us to how we get all of this to stick, by building an inclusive hiring culture. Process does not fix everything. As we learned, there was a process introduced that did shift the dynamic for hiring practices in tech. So encourage your team environment to be inclusive and hold yourselves to a certain standard. Use language that encourages you to be inclusive, and these choices really matter. If your team is lacking in diversity, then the person that you bring in from an underrepresented group isn't going to fit. So stop using the word culture fit and instead think about it as a culture add. Maybe your team is lacking in on-call skills and you want to add somebody to your team who can bring that skill. It really subtly shifts your mindset to, do we want someone who's exactly like us, or do we want somebody who can bring something different? Also, underrepresented as a word encourage us to think a little bit more about the community where that person comes from instead of othering them as, oh, well, this is the token diversity hire. And lastly, there's no such thing as an ideal candidate or a perfect candidate. So let's just use the word candidate. Nobody's perfect. Everybody has something to learn and grow in. To really reinforce this, I encourage building a team of trust. Take the team you have, make sure everyone's on board, and engage your coworkers when you notice possible bias. It can be very uncomfortable if you do notice a slip up, but remind your team, hey, we agreed on this criteria before. Find an appropriate time to talk to them about it. And I also find using personal stories can really help. So in summary, I really encourage you to rethink our interview norms. This is going to change for your organization. Find something that works for you. Get curious and learn. We're all biased, but systems and consistency can help block this bias. And bring your team in together. And with all of us working together, I know that we can make tech a more inclusive place. Thank you. Questions?
Robert Davis, Married 360. On the portion you're talking about pacing and timing for an interview, what are your recommendations when a conversation seems to run long and you want to kind of give a fair amount of time to that portion? Or conversely, if it runs short and doesn't seem to be much dialogue or isn't going very deep?
Yeah, interviewing is always a little awkward, I think, for everyone involved. So I really try to emphasize letting people know the schedule ahead of time, just kind of setting some expectations. And I'll often say, I'll move us along if we're running out of time. But I do want to not make it so rigid that I don't learn about a person. If they're really excited about a topic, it's okay to have a little wiggle room built into that schedule. Just be very mindful of the really important things that you in your loop are trying to cover. So, or if you miss something, make sure that the next person in the interview say like, hey, we ran out of time on this. Can you make sure to get some evidence around this? So that can help you kind of stay consistent. And sometimes it's okay to also just say, hey, time check. Really appreciate how passionate you are. Could you just in 3 sentences wrap this up or something? It's never really fun. It's always a little awkward, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, you can find me on LinkedIn, and to learn more, I really recommend the resources on this slide. If you're interested in the history component, I recommend the book, The Computer Boys Take Over. Thank you.